Tony Montana doesn't exist. He never existed. There was never a Cuban refugee named Antonio Tony Montana who arrived in Miami in 1980, worked as a dishwasher, climbed his way up from nothing, and became the most powerful cocaine kingpin in Florida. Al Pacino played a fictional character. Oliver Stone wrote a fictional screenplay. Brian De Palma directed a fictional movie. Scarface, the 1983 film, is not based on one specific person. Tony Montana is made up. But here's the thing that's going to change how you see that movie forever. Everything Tony Montana did in that film, every single thing actually happened in real life. The chainsaw, the machine guns in the shopping mall, the mansions, the mountains of cocaine, the Ferraris, the millions of dollars piled in closets, the paranoia, the violence, the fall. All of it was just not to one person. In April 1980, Fidel Castro, the communist dictator of Cuba, opened Mariel Harbor and did something that no world leader had ever done before. He didn't just let his people leave. He emptied Cuba's prisons. He cleared out the mental institutions. He gathered up every murderer, every rapist, every thief, every drug dealer he had locked away, and he put them on boats. He sent them to America. 125,000 Cubans arrived in Miami in the summer of 1980, and among them were approximately 25,000 criminals, men with nothing to lose, men trained by prison to be violent, ruthless, completely without fear. These men arrived in Miami at the exact moment when Pablo Escobar and the Medellín cartel were shipping tons, literal tons, of cocaine to the United States every single month. The cartel had the product, they just needed Americans to sell it. These Cuban criminals became the distributors. They became the Cocaine Cowboys. And what they built, what they lived, what they did to Miami is one of the most extraordinary, most violent, most insane, true stories in American history. Mario Tabra, Cuban refugee, arrived in Miami with nothing. Built a cocaine empire, made tens of millions of dollars, owned a private zoo with lions, tigers, and chimpanzees on his property. Eventually arrested, convicted, sentenced to 100 years in federal prison. He served 12. He's alive right now, today, at this moment. He runs a zoo in Miami. You may have seen him on Tiger King. Jon Roberts, born in New York, real name John Riccobono, connected to the mob from birth, moved to Miami, became Pablo Escobar's personal cocaine smuggler, moved billions of dollars worth of cocaine into the United States, owned 7 Ferraris simultaneously, lived in a mansion on Star Island, the most exclusive address in Miami, wrote a memoir about everything before he died in 2011. Max Mermlstein, an American, an engineer, a man who married into the Colombian cartel world, helped smuggle 56 tons of cocaine. Not kilos, tons. He eventually flipped, became a DEA informant, testified in court, entered witness protection. Nobody knows where he is today. These 3 men, plus dozens of others just like them, are Tony Montana. Oliver Stone sat down with DEA agents. He read Miami Herald newspaper articles from 1979, 1980, 1901. He talked to people who were there, and he took everything he learned, the Mariel Boatlift, chainsaw murders, the mansion parties, the machine gun massacres in shopping malls, the mountains of cash, and he compressed it all into one fictional character. Tony Montana is a composite, a collage, a greatest hits album of the real Miami Cocaine Cowboys. You've seen Scarface maybe 10 times, maybe 20. You can quote it. Say hello to my little friend, the world is yours. Every day above ground is a good day. But you've never heard the real story, the actual history behind that movie, the true events that Oliver Stone used to create Tony Montana, what it was actually like to be a cocaine cowboy in Miami in 19. The money, the violence, the parties, the blood, the morgue that ran out of space for bodies and had to rent refrigerated trucks from a grocery chain just to store the dead. Tony Montana is fiction, but the Cocaine Cowboys were real, and their story is even more incredible than the movie. Before we go back to Cuba in April 1980, drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I want to see how far Scarface's reach extends. Because this movie is not just American, this movie is global. People quote Tony Montana in Lagos, in London, in Sao Paulo, in Mumbai. Hit subscribe, like this video right now. Here's what you're about to watch. The complete, true story of Miami's Cocaine Cowboy. Who they were, where they came from, how they built empires worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The violence that turned Miami into the murder capital of America. The mansions, the Ferraris, the parties where cocaine was served on silver platters, the DEA crackdown that brought it all crashing down, every fact sourced from people who were actually there. Tony Montana doesn't exist, but the men who inspired him do. Let's begin. To understand the Cocaine Cowboys, you have to understand Cuba in 1980. Most people watching this video in 2026 didn't grow up under communism. Most people have never lived in a country where the government controls everything, where there is no free press, where you cannot start a business, where you cannot leave, where disagreeing with the government can get you imprisoned. Cuba in 1980 was exactly that place. Since 1959, since Fidel Castro and his revolutionary army marched into Havana and overthrew the Batista government, Cuba had been a communist state. Castro ran everything. The government owned every business. The government controlled the newspapers, the radio, the television. There were no elections. There was no opposition. There was no freedom. And the economy was devastating. Cuba is an island 90 miles from the southern tip of Florida. It has warm weather, fertile land, beautiful beaches. Under different conditions, it could have been prosperous. But communism destroyed the economy. By 1980, ordinary Cuban families were struggling to find basic food. Wages were a few dollars a month. There were shortages of medicine, of clothing, of everything. People were hungry, people were desperate, and they could not leave. Castro had closed the borders in the early 1960s. Cubans could not travel freely. They could not emigrate to other countries. They were trapped on an island 90 miles from the richest nation on earth, watching Miami's skyline glitter across the water, unable to reach it. For 2 decades, Cubans had been trying to flee. Some built rafts and floated across the Florida Straits. Some paid smugglers to take them in small boats. Some hijacked planes. Between 1960 and 1979, tens of thousands of Cubans made it to Florida through these dangerous, illegal methods. Hundreds drowned in the attempt. But in 1979, something changed. Something happened that would set in motion a chain of events that would turn Miami into the most dangerous city in America and inspire the greatest gangster film ever made. The Cuban economy got worse, not just worse, significantly, visibly, publicly worse. The Soviet Union, which had been propping up Cuba with billions of dollars in aid, was dealing with its own problems, the war in Afghanistan, internal economic issues. The Soviet money was slowing down. Cuba was running out of food, running out of patience, running out of time. The Cuban people were furious, and in April 1980, their fury exploded. April 1st, 1980, April Fool's Day. But nobody was laughing in Havana. A group of Cubans, desperate, fed up, willing to risk everything, crashed a bus through the gates of the Peruvian embassy in Havana. They wanted asylum, they wanted out. They wanted Peru to protect them so they could eventually emigrate somewhere, anywhere away from Cuba. Peru said yes. This was a significant moment. By granting asylum to these Cubans inside their embassy gates, Peru had essentially said, we recognize that these people have a right to flee. We recognize that Cuba under Castro is not a place where people are free. Castro was furious. He made a decision that he probably calculated would be clever, a political move, a way to embarrass Peru while simultaneously getting rid of a problem. He removed the Cuban guards from the Peruvian embassy. He announced publicly, if you want to leave Cuba, go to the Peruvian embassy. Go stand inside the embassy gates. Peru says they'll take you. He thought, maybe a few hundred people will show up, maybe 1,000. It will embarrass Peru. It will make Cuba look like a country whose people are just confused and misled, easily gathered at an embassy gate. What actually happened stunned the world. Within 48 hours, within 2 days, 10,000 Cubans had flooded into the grounds of the Peruvian embassy in Havana. 10,000 people in 48 hours, packed onto the embassy grounds like a human sea. People sleeping on the grass, climbing into trees, standing shoulder to shoulder in the courtyard. 10,000 people willing to crowd into an embassy compound with no food, no bathrooms, no shelter, just to be on the other side of a gate from Cuba. The world watched in astonishment. The images went global. Newspapers around the world ran front-page photos of thousands of Cubans crammed into this embassy compound. It was a profound, undeniable statement about what life in Cuba was really like. 10,000 people had just demonstrated with their bodies that they would rather stand in a packed courtyard with no food than remain free citizens of Castro's communist paradise. Castro was humiliated. He had miscalculated badly. Instead of embarrassing Peru, he had embarrassed himself. The whole world could see that his people were desperate to escape. He needed a new plan. He needed to turn this humiliation into a weapon. And on April 20th, 1980, he announced it. April 20th, 1980. Castro goes on Cuban state television and makes an announcement that will change Miami forever. Anyone who wants to leave Cuba can leave, he says. We are opening the port of Mariel. Cuban Americans in Florida, and there were hundreds of thousands of people who had fled to Miami over the previous 2 decades can come to Mariel Harbor and pick up their relatives. Anyone who wants to go to America can go. Cuban Americans in Florida heard this and went insane with joy. Think about what this meant. These were people who had left Cuba in the 1960s, who had built new lives in Miami, who had brothers, sisters, parents, cousins, childhood friends still trapped in Cuba, people they hadn't seen in 15, 18, 20 years, and suddenly they could go get them. Within days, a flotilla formed off the coast of Florida. Hundreds of boats, fishing boats, pleasure boats, sailboats, yachts headed toward Cuba. Cuban Americans were renting, borrowing, buying every boat they could find. They were going to get their families. This period, from April 1980 to October 1980, became known as the Mariel Boatlift, named for Mariel Harbor, the port in Cuba from which the boats departed. And here is where Castro played his card. When the Cuban-American boat captains arrived at Mariel Harbor to pick up their relative, Castro's officials were waiting. They let the relatives board, but then they did something else. They forced the boats to take more passengers. You want your family? The officials said. Fine. But you're also taking these people. And they loaded the boats with inmates from Cuban prisons, patients from Cuban mental institutions, people that Castro had decided were undesirable, criminals, dissidents, people who caused problems, people the government wanted to be rid of. You want your mother? Take 10 convicts with you. You want your brother? Take 8 mental patients with him. The boat captains had no choice. If they refused, they didn't get their families. So they took everyone, they packed their boats so tightly that there was almost no room to move, and they sailed back to Florida. Castro made a speech about it. He said publicly that Cuba was sending its escoria to America. The word means scum, or trash, or filth. He later said, and this is a documented quote, that they were flushing the toilets of Cuba into the United States. He said this proudly. He had turned a humanitarian crisis into a military operation. He had used desperate Cuban Americans' love for their families against them. He had emptied his prisons not through a jailbreak, but through a refugee operation run by American civilians in rental boats. It was brilliant in the most diabolical sense of the word, and it worked perfectly. Between April and October 1980, 125,000 Cubans arrived in Florida. To understand the scale of this, Miami in 1980 had a population of about 350,000 people. 125,000 new arrivals in 6 months means that Miami's population increased by more than a third in half a year. Imagine your city suddenly growing by a third almost overnight. The infrastructure collapses, the schools overflow, the hospitals can't handle it, the government processing systems break down completely. That is what happened to Miami. The US government set up processing centers. The Orange Bowl, the famous football stadium, became a temporary refugee camp. Tent cities appeared in parks. The processing was chaotic, overwhelmed, understaffed. The interviewers and immigration officials were supposed to identify who was a legitimate refugee and who was a criminal sent by Castro. But how do you do that? Cuba's records were either incomplete or falsified deliberately. The criminals among the Marielitos, as they were called, lied about their backgrounds. They said they were factory workers, fishermen, farmers. They said they had never been in prison. And the United States, overwhelmed by 125,000 arrivals, could not verify any of it. Of the 125,000 people who arrived, approximately 100,000 were exactly what they appeared to be. Regular Cuban families, workers, students, people who simply wanted freedom. They reunited with relatives, they started new lives, they worked hard. They became part of Miami's Cuban-American community. Many of them became successful, productive, outstanding American. The Mariel Boatlift produced doctors, engineers, teachers, artists, entrepreneurs, but approximately 25,000 of the Mariel arrivals were what Castro had said they were. Criminals, people with violent histories, men who had committed murders, rapes, armed robberies, men who had dealt drugs, men who had been in Cuba's prisons for years and who arrived in Miami with no family connections, no job prospects, no legal path forward, and absolutely no hesitation about using violence to get what they wanted. These 25,000 men were released from the processing centers with nowhere to go. No family waiting for them, no job, no apartment, no English, no money, no prospects, just the streets of Miami. And Miami in 1980 was the most cocaine-saturated city in America. Here is the thing about history that makes it so extraordinary. Sometimes the timing is so precise, so perfectly aligned, that it seems almost engineered. The Mariel Boatlift criminals arrived in Miami at exactly the moment when the cocaine trade needed them. Let's explain what was happening in Miami in 1980, because most people don't fully understand the scale of it. Pablo Escobar and the Medellín cartel, I covered this in depth in my Pablo Escobar videos, had by 1980 built the most efficient cocaine production and smuggling operation in history. Escobar had massive coca plantations in Colombia. He had laboratories that could process hundreds of kilos of cocaine per day. He had planes, boats, and distribution networks. The problem was simple. Escobar could produce cocaine in Colombia. He could ship it to the United States. But once it arrived in America, he needed people on the ground to actually sell it. American distributors, people who knew the streets, people who could move product quickly and handle trouble when it arose. The Colombians had tried using their own people in Miami in the late 1970s. Colombian immigrants, mostly. It worked, but there were limitations. The Colombian community in Miami was relatively small, and the violence that came with the cocaine trade was becoming visible. Too visible. The Colombians needed to expand their distribution network. Then the Mariel Boatlift happened. 25,000 Cuban criminals landed in Miami with no money, no jobs, no options, and no fear. Many of them had connections to each other from Cuban prison. They knew how to organize, they knew how to intimidate, they knew how to use violence effectively. They spoke Spanish, which meant they could communicate with the Colombians. And they were hungry. Desperately, savagely hungry for money and power. The Medellín cartel saw this and understood it immediately. Here was a ready-made distribution network. Here were men who could move cocaine on the streets of Miami and who would not hesitate to kill anyone who interfered. The Colombians had the supply. The Mariel criminals had the streets. They found each other almost immediately. Within months of arriving in Miami, significant numbers of the Mariel criminals had connected with the Colombian cartel networks operating in the city. They were buying cocaine wholesale from Colombian suppliers and selling it retail to Americans. They were making money, more money than any of them had ever imagined existed in the world. This is the origin of the Cocaine Cowboy. This is where Tony Montana's story really begins. To fully understand how 25,000 violent criminals could arrive in an American city and essentially disappear into the population, you have to understand what the Mariel processing looked like on the ground. The Orange Bowl Stadium in Miami, normally used for football games, concerts, events. In the summer of 1980, it was a tent city. Cots packed tightly together on the artificial turf, thousands of Cuban refugees sleeping under the stadium lights, children crying, men wandering, lines for food that stretched for hundreds of yards. Immigration officials, the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, were hopelessly overwhelmed. They had been set up to process a few dozen immigrants a day. They were now processing hundreds, then thousands. The paperwork was drowning them. The interpreters were exhausted. The background check systems were primitive. This was 1980 before computers were everywhere. Most of the checking was done by hand, with phone calls to agencies that often didn't answer. The FBI did what it could. Agents interviewed the Mariel arrivals looking for signs of criminal history, but as I said, the Cubans with criminal backgrounds lied. They had been coached by Castro's officials before they left Cuba on what to say and what not to say. They claimed to be workers, farmers, tradespeople. They claimed they had no criminal history, and without Cuban records, which Castro was not going to provide, there was no way to prove otherwise. Some were caught. Some had obvious criminal records from before 1959, when Cuba and the United States still had some information sharing. Some were visibly unstable, mental patients who had been on medication in Cuba and who, without that medication in the chaos of the processing centers, were clearly unwell. But the majority passed through. They got their processing papers, they got their temporary residence status, they walked out of the Orange Bowl or Tamiami Park or the other processing centers, and they stood on the streets of Miami. The legitimate refugees, the families, the workers, were claimed quickly by relatives. Cuban-American families from Miami showed up at the processing centers with signs, with photographs looking for their people. They found them. They took them home. But nobody was waiting for the criminals. Nobody had a sign with their name on it. Nobody came to pick them up. They were released into Miami with almost nothing. Some had a few dollars. Some had the clothes on their backs and nothing else. They gathered in neighborhoods where other Cuban immigrants lived. Little Havana, Hialeah, sections of Miami Beach. They slept on floors, in parks, in abandoned buildings. They were dangerous men with nothing to lose. And in the summer of 1980, Miami was about to teach them exactly how to acquire everything. It's absolutely crucial, before we go any further, to make something clear. The vast majority of the people who arrived in the Mariel Boatlift were good people. I want to say that plainly and loudly because the history of the Mariel Boatlift is often reduced to the criminal element, and that is not fair to the tens of thousands of Cubans who arrived in 1980 and went on to build remarkable lives in America. The teachers who became teachers again, the doctors who went back to school, relearned medicine in English, and saved American lives in American hospitals, the factory workers who started small businesses that grew into successful companies, the musicians who brought Cuban music to Miami and changed the culture of an entire city, the parents who worked 3 jobs so their children could go to college, the children themselves who grew up to become lawyers, architects, professors, military officers, community leaders. These people are also the legacy of the Mariel Boatlift. But for the purposes of this video, for understanding where the Cocaine Cowboys came from, we have to focus on the 25,000 men for whom Miami did not become a land of opportunity in the traditional sense. These men looked at Miami and saw a different kind of opportunity. They had arrived in the cocaine capital of the world at the peak of the cocaine boom. The Medellín cartel was moving so much cocaine through Miami that DEA agents years later described the situation as like trying to drink from a fire hose. The money was everywhere, the parties were everywhere, and the violence that the Colombians used to protect their business was something these Cuban criminals understood completely. They had grown up in violence. Cuban prisons were brutal. Survival in Havana's criminal underworld before the Mariel Boatlift required a willingness to hurt people that most normal human beings cannot comprehend. These men were not frightened by the Colombian cartel's violence. They embraced it. They spoke the same language, not just Spanish, but the language of power, the language of fear, the language of what happens to people who don't pay what they owe, who steal from the wrong organization, who open their mouths to the wrong authorities. Within months, they had inserted themselves into the cocaine trade. And within a few years, some of them had built empires that would make Tony Montana's fictional empire look modest by comparison. Before I introduce you to the real Cocaine Cowboys, I need to make sure everyone watching understands exactly how the cocaine business works. Because the scale of it, the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale, is essential to understanding why men like Mario Tabra, Jon Roberts, and Max Mermlstein could make so much money so quickly. Start at the beginning. Start in Colombia. The coca plant grows in the Andean mountains of Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. It has been grown by indigenous people in South America for thousands of years. The coca leaf itself contains cocaine alkaloids, the chemical compound that becomes cocaine when processed. Pablo Escobar and the Medellín cartel, starting in the early 1970s and reaching their peak in the late 1970s and early 1980s, had built the most sophisticated cocaine production operation in history. They had thousands of acres of coca plants under cultivation in remote Colombian jungle regions. They had laboratories called cocaine labs or paste labs, where the coca leaves were processed into cocaine paste and then into the white powder cocaine that Americans were buying. The processing was chemical. It involved solvents, acids, and skilled chemists. Escobar hired the best chemists. He built labs deep in the jungle, accessible only by small plane or by boat, invisible to surveillance. He produced hundreds of kilos of cocaine per day. Then he had to get it to America. This is where smugglers like Barry Seal, who I covered in a previous video, came in. Pilots and boat captains who flew or sailed cocaine from Colombia to the United States. The routes were creative and constantly changing. Colombia to the Bahamas, then small boats to Florida. Colombia to Mexico, then across the border by land, Colombia to private airstrips in rural Louisiana or rural Florida, where Escobar's cocaine was unloaded from planes in the middle of the night. Once the cocaine arrived in Florida, usually in Miami, it needed to be distributed, broken down from the large shipments into smaller quantities, sold to dealers throughout Miami, then exported to dealers in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, every major American city. This is where the Cocaine Cowboys came. The business model was almost laughably profitable. A kilo of cocaine, 2.2 pounds, a bit more than a liter bottle of soda, cost approximately $10,000 to $15,000 to buy wholesale from the Colombian. That same kilo, broken down and sold on the streets of Miami, was worth $50,000 to $60,000. Buy it for $15,000. Sell it for $55,000. Clear $40,000 profit on 1 kilogram. The top Cocaine Cowboys were not moving 1 kilo at a time. They were moving hundreds of kilos per month. Some were moving thousands. Jon Roberts, at his peak, was handling shipments of multiple tons of cocaine per single delivery. A ton of cocaine. 2,200 pounds, roughly $2 million to buy from Escobar, worth $10 million on the street, multiple tons, multiple times per month. The money was not millions of dollars, it was billions. Over the course of the early 1980s, the total value of cocaine that flowed through Miami has been estimated at between $50 and $80 billion, not per year, total. Over the course of about 5 years, By comparison, the annual GDP of many small countries is less than. Miami was, for a brief period in the early 1980s, the financial center of the global cocaine trade. More money flowed through Miami, most of it cash, most of it hidden in walls and closets and storage units, than through many of the world's legitimate financials. This is the world that the Mariel criminals walked into. This is the world they were about to own. If there is one man whose life most closely parallels Tony Montana's, it is Mario Tabraue. I want you to understand this. Mario Tabra is not a movie character. He is a real person, alive right now, today in 2026. He is 65 years old. He operates a zoological foundation in Miami. If you watch the Netflix documentary Tiger King, the one about Joe Exotic and big cat owners, you will recognize his face. He appeared in that documentary. He spoke to camera. He talked about his exotic animals. And if you look at him on camera and know his history, the Tony Montana comparisons are impossible to avoid. Here is Mario Tabraue's story. Born in Cuba in 1961, his family was middle class by Cuban standards, which meant they were not starving, but they were not wealthy. They had a modest home. His father worked. They had food on the table. And then Castro's revolution changed everything. By the time Mario was a teenager, the family was struggling under the communist system like every other Cuban family. The opportunities that might have existed for a smart, ambitious young man in a free country simply did not exist in Castro's Cuba. Mario was 19 years old when the Mariel Boatlift. He was on one of those boats. He arrived in Miami in 1980 with essentially nothing, no connections, no money, no English. He spoke Spanish, and he was young, and he was in one of the richest cities in America during the greatest economic boom the drug trade had ever seen. He started small. This is a crucial point that the movie gets exactly right. Tony Montana doesn't start as a kingpin. He starts at the bottom, doing small jobs, building a reputation, proving himself. Mario Tabraue started exactly the same way. Small runs, carrying packages, delivering things without asking questions, building trust with the Colombians and with the established Cuban criminal networks in Miami. He was smart. He was reliable. He was, by all accounts of people who worked with him during this period, extremely competent. He learned the business quickly. He understood how to manage relationships with Colombian suppliers. He understood how to manage, and I'm using that word deliberately, the people who worked for him. Within a few years of arriving in Miami as a penniless refugee, Mario Tabraue had built a cocaine distribution empire. His territory was South Florida. His suppliers were connected to Griselda Blanco's organization, the godmother of cocaine, who I covered in a previous video. He was buying cocaine in quantities of hundreds of kilos at a time. He was generating millions of dollars per year, and then he spent the money. Oh, did he spend the money? The mansion that Mario Tabra built in the Miami suburbs was something that would have been completely at home as a movie set. Multiple acres, high walls around the entire property, an electronic gate at the entrance, security cameras everywhere. In 1982, when security cameras were expensive and unusual, Mario had them. Guards at the gate, dogs patrolling the perimeter at night. Inside the walls, the property was extraordinary. The main house, enormous, multiple stories, 10,000 square feet minimum, marble floors imported from Italy, custom woodwork, a kitchen that a professional chef would have been envious of. Bedrooms decorated with the most expensive furniture that Miami's high-end stores could provide. The pool, Olympic-sized, with a waterfall feature, lit at night with colored lights that turned the water different colors. The garage filled with Ferraris and Lamborghinis and Mercedes. Cars that cost more than most Americans' houses. Cars that Mario bought with cash, driving to the dealership with a bag, counting out $100 bills on the salesman's desk, while the salesman tried very hard not to appear surprised. But here's the thing that made Mario Tabraue's property different from every other Cocaine Cowboys property: the zoo. Mario Tabraue had a passion, a genuine, deep, real passion for exotic animals. This was not an affectation. This was not a cocaine cowboy accessory, like a gold Rolex or a collection of sports cars. Mario genuinely loved exotic animals in the way that some people love music or art or sports. On his property, he kept lions, tigers, chimpanzees, capuchin monkeys, exotic birds, parrots, macaws, birds that in their natural habitat lived in South American rainforests. He kept reptiles. He kept animals that most people only saw in zoos or on nature documentaries. He built enclosures for them. He hired staff to take care of them. He spent money on veterinary care for his animals that exceeded what most families spent on their children's health care. He would sometimes, late at night when everything else had gone quiet, go out and sit near the big cat enclosures and just watch them. Just be with them. This detail is important because it humanizes Mario Tabra in a way that makes his story more complex, more disturbing, and more interesting than any simple drug dealer bad narrative. He was a violent man who ran a cocaine empire and was responsible for multiple deaths. And he genuinely loved his animals and spent hours caring for them. Both of those things were true simultaneously. Tony Montana in the movie has his affectation too. The mansion, the globe, the gold everywhere, the ostentatious displays of wealth. Mario's animals were his version of that, except real. By 1985, Mario Tabra's cocaine operation was generating an estimated $75 million in revenue in 1985 dollars. That's the equivalent of well over $200 million in today's money. He was 24 years old, a Cuban refugee who had arrived in Miami 5 years earlier with literally nothing. This is the part of the story that the movie captures and that reality confirms and that you need to understand clearly. Building a cocaine empire in 1980s Miami did not happen peacefully. You could not take over territory from other dealers by being polite. You could not protect a multi-million-dollar cocaine operation from theft, from rivals, from informants with negotiation and compromise. Violence was not an occasional tool in this world. Violence was the currency. Mario Tabraue understood this. He had enforcers, men in his organization whose specific job was handling what the business world would call disputes. Disputes about payment, disputes about territory, disputes about people who had stolen from the organization or who had spoken to people they shouldn't have spoken to. Multiple murders have been attributed to Tabrau's organization during this period. The FBI and DEA, in their investigation files, document their suspicion that Tabraue was involved in several killings. Not directly, by this point he was a boss, not a street criminal, but that his organization carried out killings on his order or with his knowledge. The methods were brutal. People disappeared. People were found dead in circumstances that made clear it was not natural causes. People were tortured before being killed, not because the torture was particularly necessary, but because the message needed to be delivered, not just to the specific target, but to everyone else who might be considering crossing the organization. In the cocaine trade at this level, your reputation for violence was your insurance policy. If everyone knew that crossing Mario Tabra meant dying in a particularly unpleasant way, most people did not cross Mario Tabra. The violence created fear. The fear created order. The order protected the business. This is exactly what Tony Montana does in Scarface. He builds his reputation for violence deliberately. He kills people in ways that send messages to others. He understands intuitively that in this world, being feared is more important than being liked. Mario Tabraue understood this too. The FBI later described Mario Tabra as one of the most dangerous men in South Florida during the early 1980s. Not because he personally walked around committing crimes, by this point he was a businessman running an empire, but because the organization he commanded was capable of extreme violence and willing to exercise it without hesitation. By 1985, the DEA had Mario Tabra in their sights. The investigation had been building for years. Wiretaps on phones, physical surveillance, informants inside his organization, who had been caught on smaller charges and who agreed to provide information in exchange for reduced sentence. Financial investigators tracing the cash, looking at real estate purchases, vehicle purchases, the bizarre reality of a man in his mid-20s who had no apparent legitimate income, but who owned a mansion full of exotic animals and a garage full of Ferraris. In 1987, Mario Tabra was arrested. The charges were serious: racketeering, drug trafficking, conspiracy to murder federal agents, which is not a minor charge. This is one of the most serious charges that can be brought in the American federal court system. Conspiracy to murder federal agents carries sentences that make ordinary drug trafficking penalties look light. The trial was a federal trial. The evidence was overwhelming. Wiretap recordings, financial records, testimony from former associates who had turned informant. The government had spent years building the case, and they had built it well. Mario Tabraue was convicted. The original sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. But Mario cooperated with the government. He provided information. He helped prosecutors build cases against other people in the cocaine trade. And as a result of that cooperation, his sentence was reduced. He was ultimately sentenced to 100 years in federal prison. He served 12. He was released in 2000. He was 39 years old. And here is the ending that Oliver Stone did not give Tony Montana, but that real life gave Mario Tabra. He survived. He walked out of federal prison at 39, still young enough to build something. He took his passion for exotic animals, the zoo he had kept on his cocaine empire's grounds, and he turned it into a legitimate business. The Zoological Wildlife Foundation in Miami, a real licensed professional zoological operation. You can visit it. You can see the animals, the big cats, the primates, the birds. And in 2020, Mario Tabra appeared in Tiger King, Netflix's documentary about the exotic animal world. He sat on camera and talked about big cats with the calm authority of someone who has been around these animals for 40 years. He mentioned his past without flinching. He spoke about prison without apology. He is alive. He is 63 years old. He is running a zoo in Miami. Tony Montana died in a mansion shootout. Mario Tabra is alive. That difference between Hollywood's need for a dramatic, violent ending and the more complicated reality of a man who went to prison, survived, and built a legitimate life afterward tells you something important about the difference between movies and reality. Jon Roberts is the second major character in this story, and in some ways he is the most extraordinary. Because Jon Roberts wasn't Cuban. He wasn't a Mariel refugee. He didn't arrive in Miami with nothing in 1980. Jon Roberts was American, born in New York in 1948. His real name was John Riccobono. And from the moment of his birth, he was connected to the American underworld in ways that most people could never. His family, the Riccobono family, had connections to organized crime in New York going back generations. John grew up understanding from childhood that there was a world operating beneath the surface of legitimate American society, a world of power and money and violence where the rules were different and the rewards were extraordinary. He was not a good student in the conventional sense. He was not interested in going to college, getting a degree, climbing the corporate ladder. He was interested in money and power and the kind of life that the mob world seemed to offer, at least from the outside. By his late teens and early 20s, Jon Roberts was already involved in crime in New York. He was running with people connected to organized crime. He was doing things that, if described in detail, would have resulted in serious federal charges. But New York in the 1970s was not where the money was. The money, the real money, the kind of money that could make a young man from Queens into something extraordinary was in Miami. Jon Roberts moved to Miami in the early 1970s before the Mariel Boatlift, before the cocaine boom really began. He was early, he saw what was coming, he positioned himself, and when the Colombian cocaine trade exploded in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Jon Roberts was perfectly placed to become one of its most important American participant. What made Jon Roberts unique among the Miami Cocaine Cowboys was his direct personal relationship with Pablo Escobar. Most of the distributors in Miami never met Escobar. They dealt with intermediaries, Colombian cartel members who operated in Miami, or American brokers who served as middlemen. The actual product came from Colombia, but the chain between Escobar in Medellín and a Miami street dealer had many links. Jon Roberts was one of the very few Americans who dealt directly with Escobar himself. This happened because Jon had built a relationship of trust with the Colombians over years of reliable professional performance. He moved product efficiently, he paid on time, always, every time, without exception. He was discreet, he was effective, he handled problems without creating more problems. The Colombians valued reliability above almost everything else. In a business where everyone was a potential threat, where anyone might be an informant or a thief or an incompetent who would create disaster, a reliable professional American distributor was worth his weight in cocaine. Jon Roberts traveled to Colombia. He met Pablo Escobar in Medellín. By all accounts, including Jon's own memoir, American Desperado, written with Evan Wright and published in 2011, Escobar was impressed with Roberts. He was businesslike, he was direct, he didn't waste time with social niceties, but he wasn't disrespectful either. He had the manner of a man who had learned to function in powerful circles. The relationship that developed between Jon Roberts and Pablo Escobar was, by the standards of the cocaine trade, remarkably professional. Escobar supplied the cocaine, Roberts smuggled it to Miami and distributed it. They communicated through a network of trusted intermediaries when face-to-face meetings weren't possible. When there were disputes over quantities, over quality, over payments, they were resolved through direct negotiation rather than through violence. It was, in a twisted sense, a business partnership. And the business was moving cocaine in quantities that stagger the imagination. Jon Roberts, at the peak of his operation in the early 1980s, was handling cocaine shipments of between 1,000 and 3,000 kilos per delivery, multiple deliveries per month. The total value of cocaine that Roberts handled over the course of his time in the trade has been estimated, based on his own testimony and DEA investigation files, in the billions of dollars. Billions, with a B. Jon Roberts worked closely with a partner named Mickey Monday. Monday was a pilot, brilliant with aircraft, capable of flying anything, gifted at low-altitude navigation at night without lights or instruments, the kind of pilot who could put a small plane down on a dark, rural airstrip at 2 a.m. in rain with the kind of precision that would make military pilots nervous. The operation worked like this. Cocaine would be produced in Colombia, packaged in kilo bricks, each wrapped tightly in plastic, then wrapped again, sometimes vacuum sealed to reduce smell. The bricks would be loaded onto planes in Colombia, usually small to medium-sized aircraft, Cessnas, Piper Navajos, twin-engine planes that had been modified to carry more fuel and more cargo. The planes would fly northeast from Colombia. They would often stop in the Bahamas, which had become a major transit point for Colombian cocaine because of the thousands of small islands, many uninhabited or barely monitored, where a plane could land and refuel and transfer cargo to another plane or to a boat. From the Bahamas, cocaine would move to Florida. Sometimes by air, Mickey Monday would fly small loads directly into Florida, landing on private airstrips or rural roads, meeting Jon's trucks in the dark, transferring the cocaine in minutes, and disappearing. Sometimes by boat, the cocaine would be transferred to a speedboat in Bahamian waters and brought across the Florida Straits at night, timed for gaps in the Coast Guard's patrol patterns. Jon's team on the ground in Miami would take delivery. The cocaine would be broken down from large shipments into smaller quantities. It would be distributed through the network to Mario Tabra and other Miami distributors, to wholesalers who would send it to other cities, to dealers throughout South Florida. The cash would flow back in the other direction. Buyers paid Roberts' organization in cash, enormous quantities of cash, more cash than most banks handle in a week, moving through private hands. This is the part of the operation that was, in some ways, more complicated than the cocaine trafficking itself. Moving cocaine is difficult and dangerous. Moving billions in cash is nearly impossible without creating obvious evidence. Jon Roberts' people would collect the cash, they would count it, which alone took hours when you're counting hundreds of thousands of dollars in used bills. They would bundle it, wrap it, prepare it for movement. Some would go directly to Colombian cartel representatives in Miami. Some would be held by Roberts for his own purposes. Some would be laundered through Miami's legitimate economy. The money was staggering. Jon Roberts later estimated his personal income during the peak years of his operation at between $50 million and $100 million per year. For a man who had grown up in Queens with connections to the mob, but no particular advantages of education or inherited wealth, this was a transformation so complete as to be almost surreal. Jon Roberts and Mario Tabra were different men with different personalities, but their lifestyles converged on the same territory: extreme, almost comical excess. Jon Roberts bought a mansion on Star Island. If you have ever been to Miami Beach, you may have seen Star Island from the MacArthur Causeway. It's a small, man-made island in Biscayne Bay, just off Miami Beach. One road in, one road out. Guarded gate at the entrance. The homes on Star Island are some of the most expensive real estate in Florida. The kind of address where celebrities and billionaires live. The kind of neighborhood where the houses don't have for sale signs out front because the people selling them don't need a sign. If you can afford to buy here, you already know this place exists, and you have a realtor who will find it for you. Jon Roberts bought a house there and paid cash. He then furnished it in a way that would have made a decorator weep with joy and an economist weep with despair. Everything custom, everything imported, the best of everything available in Miami in 1982, which was not the same as the best available today, but was still extraordinarily expensive. The garage was something special. Jon Roberts owned 7 Ferraris simultaneously. Not sequentially, not 7 Ferraris over the course of his career, but 7 at the same time. Different models, different colors. The Ferrari Testarossa, the most iconic car of the 1980s, the car that appeared on so many teenagers' bedroom posters, the car that everybody who watched Miami Vice knew by sight. Jon had multiple. He also owned Lamborghinis, including the Countach with the scissor doors that opened upward. A car so dramatic in its design that it looked like something from a science fiction movie. He changed cars the way most people change clothes. Bought a new Ferrari, drove it for a week, got bored, bought another one, gave cars away to people he liked, left a car somewhere and forgot about it, had more cars than he could drive. The parties at Jon Roberts' Star Island mansion were legendary. Not legendary in the way that people use that word casually, meaning pretty good. Legendary in the sense that people who were there 30 years later still talked about them, still described specific nights in detail. The live bands playing by the pool at 2 a.m., the tables covered in cocaine that anyone could help themselves to, not hidden, not passed around secretly, just there on the table like a bowl of chips at a party. The women who showed up because Jon was known to be generous and interesting, and because his parties were where you went in Miami in 1982 if you were young and beautiful and willing to exist in a world without rules. Jon Roberts worked directly with Griselda Blanco as well, the godmother of cocaine, who I covered in my video on her. A woman so violent and so effective as a cocaine distributor that even the Medellín cartel treated her with a degree of respect that was unusual for a woman in that world. Jon and Griselda had a professional relationship. She was a supplier and sometimes a partner. He was a reliable, high-volume distributor. He witnessed things in his years in the cocaine trade that he later described in his memoir with a matter-of-factness that is itself chilling. Violence that would have traumatized a normal person. Murders carried out in front of him. Torture that he watched happen without intervening. Because interfering was not something that happened in this world. And because the alternative to being the person watching was being the person on the receiving end. including, as he described, the use of chainsaws. The chainsaw scene in Scarface is one of the most famous scenes in cinema history. Tony Montana, his friend Manny, and two other men arrive at a Miami hotel to buy cocaine. It's a trap. In a bathtub, two Colombian hitmen attack with chainsaws. Tony's friend Angel is killed. Tony watches. He is tied up. He is going to be killed the same way when his partner arrives and intervenes. It's a horrifying scene. Graphic, brutal, almost unwatchable, and it is directly inspired by real events. In Miami, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Colombian cartels used chainsaws as instruments of murder and torture on multiple documented. This was not a common occurrence. It was not as if people were being killed with chainsaws on a regular basis throughout the city, but it happened enough times, was documented enough times, and was known enough within the cocaine trade that Oliver Stone heard about it when he was researching the film and included it. One of the most documented cases involved a low-level cocaine dealer who had made the catastrophic mistake of stealing from a Colombian supplier. He was taken to a cheap motel in Miami. He was restrained. He was killed with a chainsaw. The body was discovered by a motel cleaning staff member the following morning. The scene inside the motel bathroom was so disturbing that some of the responding police officers, experienced homicide detectives who had seen terrible things, had to step outside. The reasons for using a chainsaw were not random. First, terror. The sound of a running chainsaw is terrifying in a way that a gun is not. A gun kills quickly and relatively quietly. A chainsaw creates extended, agonizing terror. The victim knows what is happening. They have time to experience the fear. In the cocaine trade, making an example of someone making their fate so horrifying that the story would spread and deter others was a significant part of the purpose of extreme violence. Second, the message. Using a chainsaw was deliberately extreme. It said, without words, we are capable of anything. There is no line we will not cross. There is no act of violence so extreme that we will hesitate to perform it. If you steal from us, if you betray us, if you even think about speaking to authorities, this is what happens. Third, and Jon Roberts alluded to this in his memoir, practical considerations regarding body disposal. A body in pieces is, from the perspective of someone trying to make evidence disappear, easier to dispose of than an intact body. This is not a pleasant thing to discuss. It is also relevant to understanding the mindset of people who committed these acts. Oliver Stone heard about the chainsaw murders from DEA agents and from the Miami Herald coverage of the era. He included the scene in Scarface not as a gratuitous shock, but as a faithful representation of something that had actually occurred. The movie scene is actually toned down. The real events were worse. Max Mermlstein is the third major character in this story, and in some ways the most unusual, where Mario Tabra was the Cuban refugee who built his own empire, and Jon Roberts was the American with mob connections who became a smuggler. Max Mermlstein was something different, an American from New York, educated. He had a college degree, an engineering background. He was not a street criminal. He was not someone who had grown up around violence. He got into the cocaine trade through his wife. Max had married a Colombian woman. Through her family, through the Colombian community in Florida, he came into contact with the Medellín cartel. And the cartel quickly realized that Max had something they needed desperately. He knew how things worked. Engineering, logistics, the practical, technical knowledge of how to move objects through space in ways that avoided detection. The cartel had cocaine. They had money to spend on smuggling operations. What they sometimes lacked was the technical expertise to design smuggling systems that actually worked reliably. Max Mermlstein became a logistics coordinator, a problem solver, the man who figured out how. How do you hide 200 kilos of cocaine inside a shipment of consumer goods? Max figured it out. He designed false compartments in furniture. He designed systems for hiding cocaine inside appliances, washing machines, refrigerators, industrial equipment that would be shipped from Colombia to the United States in legitimate-looking commercial containers. Customs agents, overwhelmed by the volume of commercial shipping, rarely inspected every container. Max's job was to make sure the containers that contained cocaine looked exactly like every other container. He developed methods for hiding cocaine inside cars, false compartments built into doors, into the firewall behind the dashboard, into modified fuel tanks, spaces so well concealed that they were essentially undetectable without dismantling the vehicle entirely. He worked on airplane modifications, designing modifications to aircraft that increased their fuel capacity and their cargo capacity in ways that weren't immediately obvious from the outside. Max Mermlstein, by his own later account and by the testimony at various trials, helped the Medellín cartel smuggle 56 tons of cocaine into the United States. Not kilograms, tons. 56 tons is 112,000 pounds, 50,800 kilograms. At street prices in the early 1980s, that volume of cocaine was worth somewhere between $2 and $3 billion. Max Mermlstein personally helped move $2 to $3 billion worth of cocaine. He was well compensated for this, not as well as Jon Roberts, who was a boss-level operator, but, well, millions of dollars over the course of his involvement with the cartel, a comfortable Miami lifestyle, the kind of money that could, if you were careful and smart, have been quietly laundered and converted into a legitimate, comfortable life. But the cartel began to suspect Max. Money went missing, or at least money that the cartel thought should be there wasn't. Whether Max had actually stolen anything, or whether the accounting was simply wrong in an organization where nobody kept clean books, is something that was never definitively established. But the cartel began to look at Max Mermlstein as a potential problem. In the cocaine trade, a potential problem had a simple solution. Max understood what was coming, and before the cartel could move against him, Max moved first. He went to the DEA. He became an informant. He agreed to provide information, testimony, and cooperation in exchange for protection and a reduced or eliminated criminal charge. He entered into what the government calls a cooperation agreement. And then he told the DEA everything he knew about the Medellín cartel's operations in the United States, the names, the routes, the methods, the amounts, the contacts, the safe houses, the bank accounts, the people. Max Mermlstein's testimony helped convict dozens of cocaine traffickers. It provided the DEA with an inside view of the cartel's operations that they had never had before. It was, by the DEA's own later assessment, one of the most valuable pieces of cooperation they received during the entire Miami cocaine war. He entered witness protection. His location is classified. He wrote a memoir, The Man Who Made It Snow, that was published in 1990, and provided an extraordinary inside view of how the cocaine trade actually functioned at the logistics level. As of the time of writing this script, nobody outside the witness protection program knows where Max Mermlstein is. He may still be alive. He may be living as someone else entirely, somewhere in America, under a different name, with a different history, hoping that the people he testified against have either died or forgotten. There is a way to describe Miami in 1980 that makes it sound exciting, glamorous. The cocaine, the money, the Ferraris, the parties, the beautiful people, the tropical nights, and all of those things existed. All of those things were real. But here is the other description of Miami in 1980. In 1980, Miami had the highest murder rate of any major city in the United States. More murders per capita than New York. More than Los Angeles, more than Chicago, more than Detroit. The numbers: approximately 621 murders in Miami in 1981, in a city of approximately 350,000 people. That's roughly 180 murders per 100,000 residents. To put that in perspective, the current murder rate in the most violent cities in America, cities that are considered genuinely dangerous, cities that make national news for their violence, is roughly 30 to 50 murders per 100,000 residents. Miami in 1981 was 3 to 6 times more violent than the most violent American cities today. The Miami-Dade County Medical Examiner's Office, the morgue, ran out of space for bodies. This is a sentence that needs to be read slowly. The place where dead people go. The official government facility responsible for storing and processing the bodies of people who had been murdered ran out of space. The medical examiner's office was forced to rent refrigerated trucks from a local grocery distribution company to use as temporary storage for murder victims. The bodies were stacked in refrigerated trucks parked outside the medical examiner's building, while the forensic pathologists worked as fast as they could to process them and release them to families for burial. This was reported by the Miami Herald. Front page. Photographs of the refrigerated trucks parked outside the medical examiner's building. The images appeared in newspapers around the country and around the world. America was shocked. This was not a war zone in a foreign country. This was Miami, Florida, one of the most popular vacation destinations in America. A city where tens of thousands of tourists came every year for the beaches, the weather, the nightlife, and the morgue was using grocery trucks to store the overflow of murder victims. The federal government was deeply embarrassed. President Reagan, who had taken office in January 1981 on a platform that included fighting crime and drugs, was briefed on the Miami situation and found it unacceptable. The DEA was given expanded resources. The FBI increased its presence. A federal task force was established specifically to address South Florida's drug violence. But in 1980, 1981, 1982, the peak years, the violence continued without slowing down. The murders in Miami during this period were not random. They were not the result of domestic disputes or drunk driving or the 1,000 ordinary misfortunes that account for most violent deaths in most cities in most years. They were overwhelmingly drug-related killings. The Cocaine Cowboys were killing each other over territory, over debts, over insults, over suspicions of betrayal. The Colombian cartel enforcers, brought from Colombia specifically to handle problems, were killing people throughout Miami, in parking lots, in apartment buildings, in cheap motels, in expensive restaurants, in their cars. The Miami Police Homicide Unit, during this period, described their caseload as something unlike anything American law enforcement seen since the gang wars of the 1920s. The difference from the 1920s was the scale and the weapons. 1920s gang wars were fought with pistols and shotguns. Miami's cocaine war was fought with MAC-10 machine pistols, Uzi, submachine guns, AK-47 assault rifles, military-grade weapons capable of firing dozens of rounds per second in the hands of men who were willing to use them in public places with no concern for witnesses or bystanders. The Colombians in particular had a style of violence that Miami police described as fundamentally different from anything they had encountered before. The Italian-American mob, the mafia, operated on principles of discretion. You didn't kill someone in a public place if you could avoid it. You didn't use automatic weapons in shopping malls. You didn't leave bodies in places where civilians would stumble across them immediately. The mafia, whatever its many sins, understood that excessive public violence attracted the kind of attention that made business difficult. The Colombians did not operate on this principle. They had come from a country where the government itself had essentially given up trying to control the cartel's violence, where judges were assassinated if they ruled against the cartel, where presidential candidates were murdered, where car bombs went off in capital cities. The Colombian traffickers had developed their methods in an environment where there essentially were no limits, where the state was too weak, too corrupt, or too frightened to effectively constrain them. They brought those methods to Miami, and the Miami Cocaine Cowboys, the Mariel Cubans who had absorbed the Colombian style, adopted them completely. July 11th, 1979. This date is important. The Dadeland Mall Massacre happened before the Mariel Boatlift. It was a product of the earlier Colombian cocaine war that had been building in Miami since the mid-1970s. But it is impossible to tell the story of Miami's cocaine wars without understanding Dadeland, because Dadeland was the moment when the reality of the drug war became impossible for ordinary Miami residents to ignore. The Dadeland Mall, a large suburban shopping mall in the Kendall area of Miami-Dade County, a completely normal American shopping mall, department stores, food court, parking lot, families shopping on a Thursday afternoon. German Jimenez Pineso was a Colombian cocaine trafficker. He was shopping at the mall with his bodyguard, Juan Carlos Hernandez. They had gone to a liquor store inside the mall to pick something up. The hit team was waiting. Ordered by Griselda Blanco, the godmother of cocaine, the team arrived in a white Ford Econoline van. Inside the van, two men armed with MAC-10 machine pistols and at least one shotgun. The MAC-10 is a weapon that deserves description for people who are not familiar with. It is a compact, boxy, brutally efficient machine pistol. It fires .45 caliber ammunition or 9mm ammunition at approximately 1,200 rounds per minute. 1,200 rounds per minute. At its maximum rate of fire, you can fire all 30 rounds in its magazine in less than 2 seconds. In the parking lot of the Dadeland Mall on a Thursday afternoon in July 1979, Griselda Blanco's men used these weapons on German Jimenez Pineso and Juan Carlos Hernandez. The shooting was over in perhaps 30 seconds. German and Juan were both killed, multiple rounds each. The MAC-10s had been fired with the kind of casual, almost business-like efficiency that speaks of professional training and no moral hesitation whatsoever. In the parking lot of a shopping mall, in the middle of the afternoon, shoppers scattered. People who had been walking to their cars dropped their bags and ran. A woman pushing a stroller dove behind a parked car. A group of teenagers coming out of a department store froze, then ran back inside. A security guard, hearing the shots, called police and then took cover behind his booth rather than intervene against men with machine guns, which was the correct decision. When Miami-Dade police arrived, they found the bodies of German and Juan in the parking lot. They found spent MAC-10 casings, dozens of them, scattered on the asphalt. They found bullet holes in multiple parked cars. They found a white Econoline van, abandoned a short distance away. Inside the van, more weapons, more ammunition, and cocaine. The aftermath was stunning in its national impact. Miami went from being covered in the news as a resort city and a retirement destination to being covered as a war zone. The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, network television news, all of them ran the story. The photographs of the crime scene, the parking lot of a completely normal American suburban shopping mall, cordoned off with police tape, investigators in suits walking between the shell casings, were impossible to process without a deep, visceral discomfort. This was not a dark alley in a dangerous neighborhood late at night. This was a shopping mall. In the afternoon, the kind of place where American families of every background went on ordinary days to buy ordinary things. The cocaine war had come to the most civilian possible setting. And this was only the beginning. One of the methods that the Colombian cartel had imported from their home country was the car bomb. In Medellín and Bogotá, car bombs had been used by drug traffickers against enemies, against judges who had ruled against them, against politicians who had tried to extradite them to the United States. It was a weapon of extreme power and extreme cowardice. Simultaneously, you placed it while the target was away, and then you waited, and when the target got in their car and turned the key, they died. In Miami, car bombs became part of the cocaine war's arsenal. The method was simple. The perpetrator, or more likely a hired specialist, would place an explosive charge under the target's vehicle, usually attached to the frame with magnets or wire connected to the ignition system. When the target started the car, the charge detonated. Multiple car bombings occurred in Miami between 1979 and 1984. The effect on the community, on ordinary people who lived in neighborhoods where these things were happening, was profound. People became afraid to start their cars, genuinely, practically afraid. Miami residents who lived near Cocaine Cowboys or who worked in businesses that served them developed the habit of checking under their vehicles before getting in, looking for wires, looking for anything that shouldn't be there. This is not an abstract statement. This is document. Miami Herald, reporting from the period, includes interviews with Miami residents, teachers, doctors, business people, ordinary working people who lived in affected neighborhoods, who described checking under their cars every morning before driving to work, who had started their cars by remote control or by having someone else start them first, who had changed their routines to avoid being predictable, to avoid being in the same place at the same time every day because they were afraid. This fear, this generalization of the cocaine war's violence into the daily lives of ordinary Miami residents is something that the movie Scarface does not capture fully. The movie focuses on the criminals, on Tony's world, on the business and the violence within that world. What it doesn't show is what happens to an entire city when it becomes the site of a war between criminal organizations willing to use military-grade weapons in public spaces, the Mutiny Hotel bartender checking under his car before the early morning drive home, the elementary school teacher who changed her jogging route because there had been a shooting 2 blocks from her usual path, the restaurant owner who had to decide whether the extra business from Cocaine Cowboy customers was worth the risk of becoming a target if someone decided his restaurant was where the next hit would take place. This is the real cost of what the Cocaine Cowboys built. Another method that the Colombians brought to Miami that became characteristic of the cocaine war was the motorcycle assassination. In Colombia, the sicario, the professional hitman, often worked from a motorcycle, a driver and a shooter. The driver could navigate through traffic, approach a target's vehicle in traffic, and pull up alongside it while the shooter fired through the window. Then the motorcycle could accelerate away faster than any police response. This method was cheap. It required a motorcycle, cheap, 2 people, cheap, and guns available. It was fast, it was effective, and because it could be done in traffic, on the highway, on city streets, at a red light, it was extraordinarily difficult to protect against. In Miami, between 1979 and 1984, multiple murders were carried out using exactly this method. Targets were followed by motorcycles, caught in traffic, killed through their car windows by men riding on the back of bikes, then carried away in traffic before police could respond. The Miami police eventually identified a specific pattern in some of these murders, the same general method used in multiple cases, suggesting a single team of Colombian assassins who were operating in Miami on a contract basis, available to any cartel member or cocaine cowboy who needed someone killed and could pay the fee. This was the industrialization of murder. The cocaine trade had become so large, had generated so much money, involved so many people and so many competing interests that it had created a market for professional murder specialists, men who killed for pay, who had no other profession, who traveled from Colombia to Miami to carry out specific assignments and then returned to Colombia. The Miami Homicide Unit, which was handling 600 plus murders a year at the peak of this period, was dealing with a category of crime they had essentially no experience. They knew how to investigate domestic murders. They knew how to investigate gang murders within recognizable local gang structures. They did not know how to investigate murders carried out by Colombian contract killers who arrived in Miami, completed their assignment, and left the country before the body was even cold. The solve rate for cocaine war murders, the percentage of cases that resulted in an arrest and conviction, was catastrophically low. Many of these murders were never solved. The killers were never identified, never arrested, never prosecuted. They went home to Colombia. I want to take a moment here before we move to the lifestyle section to acknowledge something that the movie Scarface, and indeed most movies about this world, largely omits: the victim. Not the Cocaine Cowboys, not the Colombian cartel members, not the DEA agents, the ordinary people. The people who had nothing to do with the cocaine trade, but whose lives were destroyed by it anyway. The woman killed in a drive-by shooting on her front porch because a cocaine cowboy and his rival happened to be settling a dispute in front of her house. The wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong neighborhood, the cocaine addict. Miami in the early 1980s was awash in cocaine. And cocaine, despite its glamorous image in the media of the period, is a profoundly destructive drug. It is addictive. It destroys health, relationships, careers, families. The people consuming the cocaine that the cowboys were selling were not all partygoers at the Mutiny Hotel. Many were ordinary people who started using recreationally and could not stop, who lost their jobs, who lost their families, who ended up in situations that destroyed them. The children of the addicts. A generation of Miami children who grew up in households where a parent was addicted to cocaine, who witnessed violence in their neighborhoods as a regular feature of childhood, who normalized things that no child should ever normalize. The Colombian community in Miami, the vast majority of Colombian immigrants in Miami in the 1980s had nothing whatsoever to do with the cocaine trade. They were ordinary people who had come to America for ordinary reasons: work, opportunity, safety, the same things that have brought immigrants to America throughout its history. The cocaine war painted their entire community with a single, unjust brush. The word Colombian in Miami in the early 1980s triggered fear in ways that were unfair to hundreds of thousands of innocent people. This is the real cost of the Cocaine Cowboys, not the movie version where the camera follows the criminal and makes his journey exciting and his lifestyle glamorous. The real cost was measured in destroyed lives, in children who grew up without parents because those parents were addicted or killed, in neighborhoods that looked like war zones, in a city that was genuinely not safe for ordinary people to live their ordinary lives. The movie doesn't show you that. I'm showing it to you now. Cocaine Cowboys didn't invest in stocks. They didn't put their money in pension funds. They didn't buy treasury bonds. They bought mansions. South Florida real estate in the early 1980s was not as expensive as it is today. The transformation of Miami into one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world came later. In 1981, a spectacular waterfront mansion in Miami could be purchased for $2 or $3 million. Extraordinary by most people's standards. A trivial amount of money for men who were making $50 million per year. The neighborhoods Cocaine Cowboys favored had specific quality: privacy. The property needed to be screened by walls, by vegetation, by the natural topography of the land, from the view of the street and of neighbors. What happened inside needed to be invisible from outside. Security. High walls, electronic gates, security systems. The Cocaine Cowboys were paranoid because paranoia was rational. There were genuinely people who wanted to kill them. Property that could be secured was not a luxury, it was a business necessity. Access to water. Many Cocaine Cowboys wanted properties on Biscayne Bay, on canals with dock access. A boat provided escape routes. It provided a way to move things. Cocaine, cash, people that didn't involve driving through police checkpoints on roads. Star Island, as I mentioned in Jon Roberts' section, was the ultimate address. The houses on Star Island in the early 1980s were owned by a mixture of legitimate, wealthy people, entertainers, business people, old Florida money, and Cocaine Cowboys, who had the same kind of money without the legitimate source. The contrast must have been extraordinary and bizarre. A retired business executive in his 70s living next door to Jon Roberts, watching from his window as a parade of Ferraris drove past his gate at 3 a.m., while music thumped from his neighbor's pool area. The houses themselves were monuments to excess. Walk through a typical Cocaine Cowboy mansion of this period, and what you find is the result of someone with unlimited money and no particular taste, or more precisely, with the specific taste of someone who grew up with nothing and is now expressing wealth as loudly and visibly as possible. The floors are marble, imported marble, Italian marble preferred, because Italian marble was the most expensive and therefore the most impressive. The ceilings are high, 14, 16, 18 feet, not because high ceilings have any practical utility, but because they signal wealth. The furniture is large and elaborate. Carved wood, gold accents, the kind of furniture that fills space in a way that says, I have so much space that I needed to buy furniture this large just to fill it. The art on the walls is more interesting. Some Cocaine Cowboys bought real art, legitimate pieces from legitimate galleries. Some of them through a combination of good luck and the advice of gallery owners who saw money coming through their door, ended up with pieces that appreciated significantly in value. Others bought things that looked expensive but weren't. Reproductions, fakes, things that seemed impressive but that any actual art expert would have recognized immediately as without real value. The weapons were everywhere, hidden in closets, behind false walls, in drawers and underbeds. The Cocaine Cowboys were armed in their homes because their homes were not really sanctuaries, they were targets. Anyone who knew where you lived and was willing to attempt a robbery or a murder knew where to find you. The mansion was a fortress, and in a fortress you kept your weapons close. Here is a problem that most people never have to think about. What do you do when you have so much money that you literally cannot deal with it? The Cocaine Cowboys had this problem. At the peak of the trade, the major operators were generating cash, physical paper currency, at rates that overwhelmed their ability to manage it. Jon Roberts later described in his memoir having closets literally stacked floor to ceiling with bricks of cash. $100 bills, bundled in $10,000 packets, stacked like firewood. The immediate problem was counting it. When you receive $500,000 in used $20 and $50 bills from a cocaine sale, you need to count it. You need to verify the amount. You need to document it. Even criminal organizations need records. The alternative is chaos. Counting $500,000 in mixed bills can take 4 to 6 hours for an experienced money counter. Jon Roberts and other major operators were often receiving multiple payments like this per week. He needed counting machines, industrial currency counters that processed bills automatically. He had multiple machines running simultaneously, often for hours at a time, as teams of trusted employees processed the incoming cash. The second problem was storage. Banks were not an option for obvious reasons. Depositing large amounts of cash into a bank account triggers federal reporting requirements. Banks are required to file reports on cash deposits over $10,000. A cocaine cowboy couldn't walk into a Citibank with $2 million in cash without immediately triggering a federal investigation. So the cash had to be stored privately, and the only private storage options were physical, your own property, safes, hidden compartments, buried containers, false walls. Jon Roberts described hiding money inside the walls of his mansion. Not metaphorically, literally opening up a section of wall, placing bricks of cash inside and sealing the wall back up. There were sections of his house where the walls were, in effect, a bank vault. Mario Tabra had similar issues, multiple hiding places throughout his property, cash buried in waterproof containers in the grounds of the estate. Max Mermlstein, in his memoir, described the surreal experience of having so much cash that some of it was simply lost, hidden in a location that was later forgotten, or hidden by someone who died before they could reveal where it was, or hidden so well that even the person who hid it couldn't always find it. The money laundering operations attempted to address this problem. real estate purchases, business front companies, car washes, restaurants, retail stores, through which drug money could be cycled, cleaned, and returned as legitimate income. But even the most sophisticated laundering operations of the period could not keep up with the volume of cash being generated. Some of that money was simply never recovered. Somewhere in South Florida, buried in yards, hidden in walls, stored in containers in locations that the people who put it there are either dead or in prison and can no longer access, there is an unknowable amount of cocaine money waiting. The Ferraris deserve their own section because they were not incidental to the Cocaine Cowboy story. They were central to it. They were the most visible, most obvious, most public expression of the Cocaine Cowboy identity. A Ferrari in 1982 cost between $60,000 and $150,000 depending on the model. This is the equivalent of $180,000 to $450,000 in today's money. These were not merely expensive cars. They were statement objects. A Ferrari was so expensive, so unusual, so conspicuous that owning one was a declaration. I have money, more money than most people see in a lifetime. And I'm not hiding it. For the Cocaine Cowboys, this was exactly the point. Many of them had come from Cuba with nothing. Many had grown up poor in the sense that communism creates a specific kind of poverty, not starvation, but a grinding scarcity, an absence of everything that signals status and success in the consumer world. No nice clothes, no nice cars, no jewelry, no visible markers of success, because in communist Cuba, success was supposed to be collective, not individual. And now they had unlimited money. The Ferrari was a declaration of individual success so loud that it was essentially a shout. I am here. I made it. I have everything you told me I could never have. Jon Roberts had 7 Ferraris simultaneously. This number, 7, comes from his own memoir and from DEA investigation files from the period. He owned the Testarossa, multiple 308s, at least one 328, a boxer. He changed them the way other people change clothes, buying new models when they were released, giving older ones away to associates, or simply abandoning them. The dealerships that sold these cars in Miami in the early 1980s must have had the most unusual client base of any car dealers in America. Men coming in with duffel bags of cash, men who didn't negotiate, who paid whatever the asking price was without discussion, because discussing price was for people who needed to worry about money. Men who bought multiple cars in a single visit. Men who, if the model they wanted wasn't in stock, paid full price on the spot and asked the dealer to call them when it arrived. The dealers processed the sales, took the cash. They were required by law to file reports on cash transaction, over $10,000. But the enforcement of those requirements in 1982 Miami was not what it became later. The reports were filed, but nobody was following up on them systematically. Not yet. The Lamborghinis were even more dramatic than the Ferraris. The Countach, in particular, the car that appeared on bedroom walls throughout the 1980s, was so visually extreme that it barely looked like a real car. The lines were almost impossible. The doors opened upward, like a bird spreading its wings. It was designed not merely to transport you from one place to another, but to make everyone who saw it stop and stare. This was not subtle. The Cocaine Cowboys were not trying to be subtle. Being subtle was for people who were afraid. No single place better represents the Miami cocaine era than the Mutiny Hotel. Located in Coconut Grove, one of Miami's oldest and most charming neighborhoods, a place of waterfront restaurants and galleries, and the kind of old Florida charm that existed before the glass towers went up, the Mutiny was not a large hotel. It was a boutique property, intimate, exclusive in the way that truly exclusive places are exclusive, not by advertising that they're exclusive, but by simply being the place where everyone who mattered went. The Mutiny had a bar, a club, a space where people gathered in the evenings and stayed until the early hours of the morning, and from approximately 1979 through the mid-1980s, this space was the Cocaine Cowboy headquarters. Every night, not most nights, every night, the parking lot outside the Mutiny was lined with Ferraris and Lamborghinis. The valets were handling cars worth more than most American families' net worth. The guests at the best tables were spending amounts of money that would have been impossible to imagine in any legitimate business context. The cocaine use was open, not hidden in bathrooms, not done discreetly at the table when other patrons weren't looking. Open, on the table, Cocaine Cowboys arrived with their own supply and set it out at their tables the way a normal person might set out a pack of cigarettes. The management of the Mutiny did not intervene because the Cocaine Cowboys tipped in amounts that would have been called generous if they weren't so absurd. A waiter at the Mutiny in the early 1980s could make $1,000 to $5,000 in tips a single night. A bartender, a valet. The people who worked at the Mutiny during this period made extraordinary amounts of money, and they were discreet about what they saw because their livelihoods depended on it. The FBI was aware of the Mutiny from relatively early in this period. They set up surveillance cameras outside, photographing the license plates of every car that came and went. Agents inside occasionally posing as customers. Photographs of who was meeting with whom, which was enormously valuable intelligence for building case files on the various cocaine trafficking networks operating in Miami. Who worked with whom? Who knew whom? Who was present at the same table as whom on a specific date? The Mutiny's guest list, as reconstructed from FBI surveillance and from the testimony of participants at various trials, reads like a who's who of the Miami cocaine trade. Jon Roberts, Mario Tabra's associate. Colombians connected to the Medellín cartel. Men whose names appear in DEA files as persons of interest in multiple trafficking investigations. Also, legitimate Miami business people who went there for the scene and didn't fully understand what they were in the middle of. Musicians and entertainers who played at the hotel. Women who had been invited by Cocaine Cowboy and who may or may not have known the full context of where they were. The Mutiny was the Babylon Club from Scarface. Oliver Stone clearly used it as a model. The fictional club in the movie, where Tony Montana holds court, where the wealthy and the criminal mingle, where cocaine flows freely and enormous amounts of money change hands in every transaction, is based on a real place that existed at 2951 South Bay Shore Drive in Coconut Grove, Miami. The mansion parties that the Cocaine Cowboys threw deserve description because they were, by any reasonable standard, among the most extravagant, private, social events in American history. Not extravagant in the way that some wealthy business person's charity gala is extravagant, where the flowers are expensive and the food is good and people in elegant clothes donate money to causes. Extravagant in the pure physical, material sense of the word. More money, more food, more alcohol, more cocaine, more music, more people, more of everything, with no limit and no concern for cost. A typical Cocaine Cowboy mansion party of this period might involve 100 to 200 guests. The host would have hired professional caterers, not the kind that do corporate events, but the kind that staffed Miami's best restaurants and were available for private events if the price was right. Champagne by the case, the most expensive bottles available, bought in quantities that would have stocked a restaurant for months. The cocaine was everywhere. This is not an exaggeration for effect. Multiple participants in this world interviewed in the Cocaine Cowboys documentary and in various written accounts describe cocaine being present at every party in quantities that made the normal behavior of 1980s party culture, where cocaine was common but still somewhat discreet, look modest by comparison. Bowls of cocaine, plates of cocaine, cocaine available to every guest without restriction or charge. The host was providing it as a form of hospitality. The music was live. Bands were hired, not just DJs, though there were DJs also, but actual live bands that would set up by the pool and play throughout the night. sometimes multiple bands rotating through sets. The music could be heard for blocks. The women who attended these parties came from various backgrounds: models, actresses, doing television work in Miami, young women from Miami's social scene who had been invited by someone who had been invited, women who had met a cocaine cowboy at the Mutiny and been brought to his home. The parties lasted for days, not hours. Multiple accounts describe parties that started on Friday evening and were still going, with guests coming and going in waves on Sunday afternoon. Food being replenished, cocaine being replenished, new guests arriving as earlier guests left or passed out or simply needed to stop. This was Tony Montana's lifestyle, made real and multiplied across dozens of men throughout Miami. Empires fall for reasons, and the Cocaine Cowboys' empires fell for specific, predictable, almost inevitable reasons that were built into the nature of the enterprise from the beginning. The first reason was visibility. The Cocaine Cowboys were not, in the way of successful long-term criminal enterprises, invisible. The mafia in America had survived for decades, partly because it maintained a facade of normalcy. Mob bosses owned restaurants, construction companies, garbage collection businesses. They dressed like business people. They lived in nice but not ostentatious homes. They drove appropriate cars. They attracted attention they could not afford. The Cocaine Cowboys attracted attention they absolutely could not afford, and they did it intentionally, proudly, constantly. 7 Ferraris, a private zoo with lions and tigers, parties where the neighbors could hear the music 3 blocks away, a regular presence at the most FBI-surveilled nightclub in Miami, cash purchases of multi-million-dollar homes by young men with no apparent legitimate income. Every one of these things was a flare fired into the night sky saying, "Here I am doing illegal things and I have unlimited money." The DEA and FBI did not need sophisticated intelligence to identify the Cocaine Cowboys. They needed to look out their office windows. The Ferraris were a problem. The mansions were a problem. The Mutiny Hotel was a problem. The sheer, extraordinary, aggressive visibility of their wealth was a problem that no amount of operational security could overcome. The second reason was violence. The Cocaine Cowboys were, as a group, constitutionally unable to resolve disputes through negotiation. When there was a conflict, a debt unpaid, a territory disputed, an insult given, the response was violence. And the violence was public, and the violence was extreme, and the public violence attracted law enforcement attention in ways that more discreet operations might have avoided. 600 murders per year in Miami, a morgue using refrigerated grocery trucks, machine gun shootouts in shopping malls, car bombs in restaurant parking lots. This level of violence was politically unacceptable. It made national news. It embarrassed the federal government. It forced the DEA and FBI to respond with resources and attention that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. The Cocaine Cowboys' violence, in a very real sense, created the investigation that destroyed them. The third reason was greed and betrayal. The cocaine trade generated extraordinary amounts of money. Extraordinary amounts of money attracted extraordinary amounts of greed. People stole, people cheated, people accused each other of stealing and cheating regardless of whether they had actually done it. Disputes over money led to violence. Violence led to arrests. Arrests led to people facing decades in federal prison. And people facing decades in federal prison sometimes made different calculations about their loyalty. The informant network that the DEA built during this period was assembled primarily from people within the cocaine trade who, when caught, decided that the cost of loyalty was too high. Low-level dealers who agreed to testify about their bosses, associates who agreed to wear wires, bookkeepers and logistics, people who knew details of the operation that were operationally valuable to prosecutors. Max Mermlstein was the most dramatic example, but he was one of many. Ronald Reagan took office as president in January 1981. One of his major domestic policy priorities was what he called the war on drugs. This phrase has been politically controversial since it was coined, and discussing its successes and failures and unintended consequences is beyond the scope of this video. What is relevant here is what it meant practically for the Cocaine Cowboys of Miami. It meant money. Lots of it. Federal money directed specifically at drug enforcement at a time when the cocaine trade was most visibly devastating Miami. The DEA's South Florida Task Force received massive funding increases. New agents, new technology, new investigative tools, wiretapping, financial forensics specialists, analysts whose specific job was following money, tracing cash from drug sales through the various laundering operations back to the original trafficker. The FBI, which had traditionally been more focused on organized crime and counterintelligence, was directed to assist with drug trafficking investigations in ways that it had not previously prioritized. The U.S. Customs Service increased its presence in South Florida. More agents, more detection equipment at ports of entry, more resources for the interdiction of incoming cocaine shipment. The U.S. Coast Guard received additional assets for maritime interdiction, faster boats, more helicopters, better radar systems for tracking small aircraft and small boats crossing the Florida Straits at night. For the Cocaine Cowboys, this increased federal presence was like a tightening vice, slowly over time, but inexorably. The smuggling routes that had worked without significant interdiction in 1980 and 1981 became progressively more dangerous by 1983 and 1984. Planes that had been flying cocaine into small Florida airstrips undetected started being tracked by new radar systems. Boats that had been running cocaine across the Florida Straits at night started encountering Coast Guard cutters that hadn't been there before. The cost of doing business increased. More elaborate smuggling methods, more expensive bribes, more routes that needed to be established, used briefly, and then abandoned when they attracted attention. More of the operation's revenue being consumed by the cost of avoiding the increasingly sophisticated law enforcement response. The investigative operations that ultimately brought down Miami's Cocaine Cowboys had various names and involved various agencies and proceeded over several years. I want to focus on the investigative methods because they were, in their own way, as sophisticated and as remarkable as the operations they were designed to dismantle. Wiretaps were central. The DEA, working with federal prosecutors, obtained court orders to tap the phones of known cocaine traffickers. This sounds straightforward, but in practice, it was enormously complex. The traffickers used multiple phones, they used code words, they changed phones regularly. The DEA needed to identify all the phones a target used, obtain legal authorization to tap each one, staff a listening operation around the clock to capture conversations in real time, and then have the conversations translated from Spanish by native speakers who could also recognize regional idioms, slang, and coded language specific to the Colombian cocaine trade. Physical surveillance, teams of agents following cocaine cowboys, photographing them, documenting every meeting, building diagrams of who knew whom, who met with whom, what the organizational structure of each trafficking network looked like. This was painstaking, time-consuming work that generated enormous amounts of information that then had to be analyzed and cross-referenced. Financial investigation. The Cocaine Cowboys' greatest vulnerability was their money, specifically the way they spent it. Every expensive car purchased with cash, every mansion bought for millions of dollars, every real estate transaction, these were all traceable. Federal investigators could go to car dealerships and obtain records of cash purchases. They could examine real estate records and trace the cash buyers. They could build a picture of how much money a person was spending and compare it to what any legitimate source of income could possibly explain. This is how the financial cases were built against Mario Tabra and others. Not from direct evidence of cocaine trafficking, though that evidence existed too, but from the simple, visible, irrefutable reality that these men were spending tens of millions of dollars and had no legitimate explanation for where the money was coming from. Undercover operation. DEA agents posing as cocaine buyers, meeting with mid-level traffickers, making small purchases of cocaine, Recording the transactions on audio and video, these small cases provided leverage. You can plead guilty to this charge, or you can cooperate and help us build the bigger case. And cooperation agreements. The cascade of flipped informants that the DEA assembled over the course of this period, each one providing a few more names, a few more details, a few more pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, completely revealed the structure of the cocaine trade. Between 1985 and 1990, the Cocaine Cowboy empire fell. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic operation, but one by one, through the relentless accumulation of evidence and the cascade of cooperating witnesses, the major operators were arrested, charged, tried, and convicted. Mario Tabra was arrested in 1987. The charges against him were extensive and serious: racketeering, drug trafficking, and, most significantly, conspiracy to murder federal aid, a charge that reflected not merely his drug trafficking, but the specific, documented, evidenced allegation that his organization had planned to kill DEA agents investigating it. The trial was a federal proceeding. The government's case was thorough. Wiretap recordings, financial forensics, testimony from former associates who had agreed to cooperate. The evidence was, by any reasonable assessment, overwhelming. Mario Tabra was convicted on all major counts. The original sentence, life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He cooperated with the government, he provided information, he helped prosecutors build cases against others, and as a result of that cooperation, his sentence was ultimately reduced. He was sentenced to 100 years in federal prison, which is a number that sounds like it means the same thing as life in prison, but which, under federal sentencing guidelines and with cooperation credit, meant something different in practice. He served 12 years. He was released in 2000. Jon Roberts was arrested in the late 1980s as the DEA's investigations expanded and the web of evidence closed around everyone who had been operating in Miami's cocaine trade at the senior level. The charges against Roberts were drug trafficking and racketeering. The evidence included his own documented transactions, the testimony of multiple associates, and the financial forensics that showed an American man living on Star Island in a multi-million-dollar mansion with 7 Ferraris and no apparent legitimate income. Jon cooperated, he provided information, he was convicted, but his cooperation earned him a significantly reduced sentence. He was released in the early 2000s. He wrote American Desperado, his memoir, co-authored with Evan Wright, and it was published in 2011. It remains one of the most detailed, most frank accounts of what the Miami cocaine trade actually looked like from the inside. Jon Roberts died in 2011, not long after the book was published. He died in a bed, not in a mansion shootout, not with a grenade launcher, in a bed, old and sick, having survived his empire by decades. Max Mermlstein, as discussed, preempted his own arrest by becoming an informant in 1985. He was the model of cooperation, providing the DEA with information that went far beyond any single case and that helped them understand the architecture of the entire Medellín cartel's American operation. He entered witness protection. He wrote his memoir, and then he disappeared into the system, into the anonymity of a new identity and a new life somewhere in America. When the Cocaine Cowboys were arrested and convicted, the federal government moved to seize their asset. This is the legal process known as civil asset forfeiture. When assets are demonstrably the product of criminal activity, bought with drug money, owned by a convicted drug trafficker, the government can take them. The mansions, the cars, the cash found in walls and safes and buried in yards. The mansions were seized and eventually auctioned. Federal marshals conducted the auction. Some of the properties sold for significant amounts to legitimate buyers, business people, developers, wealthy Florida residents who wanted the property at a discount and either didn't know or didn't care about its history. Some properties sat vacant for years during protracted legal proceedings. Some were eventually demolished and the land used for other purposes. The cars were seized The 7 Ferraris, the Lamborghinis, the Rolls Royces, they were auctioned too. Federal vehicle auction. Some of them sold for reasonable amounts. Some of them had been driven hard and maintained poorly. Cocaine Cowboys were not always fastidious about maintenance schedules and sold for less than their market value. The cash was seized, millions of dollars found in hidden compartments, in walls, in buried containers. Some of it had been damaged. Paper currency deteriorates when improperly stored, especially in Florida's humidity. Some of it was perfectly preserved and went directly into the federal government's accounting. The exotic animals on Mario Tabrau's property were seized by animal welfare authorities and placed in zoological facilities and licensed sanctuaries. The animals themselves were innocent bystanders in a story that had nothing to do with them, and their welfare during and after the seizure was a genuine concern. The total value of assets seized from Miami cocaine traffickers during this period was enormous. The DEA estimated in various reports from the late 1980s and early 1990s that the combined value of assets seized from South Florida cocaine traffickers over the course of the decade exceeded $1 billion. In 1980s dollars, and that represented only the assets that were found, the assets that the traffickers had managed to hide effectively, or to move to other jurisdictions, or to disguise through layers of legitimate business ownership were never recovered. Some of that money is still out there. Before we go through what Scarface got right and what it changed, I want to spend a moment on Oliver Stone himself and how he built the screenplay. Oliver Stone in the early 1980s was not yet the director he would become. He had written the screenplay for Midnight Express, which won him an Academy Award. He had written other screenplays. He was known as a writer. Brian De Palma, who would direct Scarface, approached him about writing a remake of the 1932 Howard Hawks film of the same name, a film about Al Capone, updated to the contemporary drug trade. Stone threw himself into research. He met with DEA agents who were working the Miami cocaine beat. He read Miami Herald newspaper archives from 1979, 1980, 1981, the years when the cocaine war was at its peak. He talked to people connected to the Miami criminal world. He absorbed as much as he could about what was actually happening in South Florida. And he was reportedly consuming significant amounts of cocaine himself during the writing process, which either improved his understanding of the subject matter or made the writing more chaotic, depending on whom you ask. What he produced was not a documentary. He was making a movie, not a history. He made choices, dramatic choices, narrative choices, character choices that are different from what actually happened. He compressed timelines, he combined characters, he invented relationships and plot points. But he worked from a foundation of genuine research. The Mariel Boatlift, the chainsaw murders, the mall massacre, the money piles, the mansion lifestyle, the paranoia, the cocaine trade's relationship between American distributors and Colombian suppliers, the eventual fall. All of these were in his research. All of these appear in some form in the movie. What he created was a fictional composite, one man, Tony Montana, living a life that was actually lived by many men. The movie is not about any one person, it's about all of them, filtered through a single dramatic lens. Understanding this is understanding what Scarface actually is. An extraordinary work of dramatic compression that takes the reality of Miami's cocaine war and reduces it to a story that can be told in 2 hours and 45 minutes and felt in the gut by an audience. The Mariel Boatlift opening is accurate. The film opens with documentary-style footage and narration establishing the Mariel Boatlift. Tony Montana is a Mariel refugee. He arrives in Miami with other Cubans. He goes through refugee processing. He has a record. Castro sent criminals, and Tony is explicitly one of them. Oliver Stone got this exactly right. The Mariel Boatlift happened exactly as described. 125,000 Cuban arrived between April and October 1980. 25,000 approximately were criminals sent by Castro. The processing centers existed, the Orange Bowl, Tamiami Park, others. The chaos of trying to process 125,000 people in 6 months while identifying which of them were criminals was exactly as Oliver Stone depicts it. The criminal, Tony Montana, arriving on Castro's order among hundreds of thousands of legitimate refugees, is an accurate composite of the Mariel criminals who became Cocaine Cowboy. The starting from nothing progression is accurate. Tony doesn't begin the movie as a kingpin. He begins as a refugee who has to prove himself through a series of small, violent jobs. He works his way up. He builds a reputation. He goes from nobody to powerful through a combination of competence, ruthlessness, and luck. This is accurate. Mario Tabra started as a low-level runner. Jon Roberts started small and built his network over years. Mermlstein entered the cartel not as a boss, but as a logistics specialist who rose to importance through competence. The progression from nothing to power was real, and the movie depicts it accurately. The chainsaw scene is accurate. As I discussed in detail in the violence section, yes, chainsaws were used as murder weapons in the Miami cocaine war. Multiple documented cases. The scene in the movie is based on a real method of killing that the Colombians and Cocaine Cowboys used in Miami. Oliver Stone heard about it from DEA agents. He put it in the movie because it was true. The money pile problem is accurate. In the movie, Tony's financial manager tells him that the money is coming in faster than it can be cleaned, that it's piling up, that they have too much cash, that the laundering operation is overwhelmed. Jon Roberts described exactly this problem in American Desperado. Mario Tabra had this problem. Mermlstein described it in The Man Who Made It Snow. The cocaine trade generated cash at rates that defeated any reasonable money management system. It piled up in walls and closets. It was a real, practical problem that the Cocaine Cowboys dealt with constantly. The mansion lifestyle is accurate. Tony's mansion, with the enormous pool, the elaborate fountain, the marble and gold interiors, the security gates, is based on reality. Mario Tabra had this. Jon Roberts had this. The Cocaine Cowboys lived in exactly this style. The movie gets the specific details right. The ostentatious excess, the arms hidden throughout the house, the contradiction between the beautiful exterior and the paranoid, violent reality inside. The paranoia is accurate. By the end of the movie, Tony Montana trusts no one. He sees enemies everywhere. He is unable to maintain relationships because his fear and suspicion have consumed him. He has isolated himself in his mansion, surrounded by cocaine and weapons and the remnants of his empire, waiting for something terrible to happen. This psychological portrait is accurate. Multiple participants in the cocaine trade, in their memoirs and in interviews, describe this progressive paranoia as a feature of the lifestyle. The cocaine use contributed to it. Cocaine paranoia is a well-documented clinical phenomenon. The actual danger contributed to it. These men were genuinely in danger, and their paranoia was not entirely irrational. The isolation that came from the lifestyle contributed to it. You cannot maintain normal friendships and relationships when your life is a constant negotiation with violence. The working relationship between American distributors and Colombian suppliers is accurate. In the movie, Tony works with a Bolivian drug lord named Alejandro Sosa. The country was changed from Colombia to Bolivia, possibly to avoid legal complications, possibly simply as a dramatic choice. But the relationship between American distributor and South American supplier depicted in the film is accurate. Jon Roberts worked directly with Pablo Escobar. The relationship between Roberts and Escobar had many of the qualities depicted in the Tony Montana and Sosa relationship: mutual utility, professional respect, and the underlying understanding that the South American supplier held the fundamental power because he controlled the supply. The Babylon Club is based on the Mutiny Hotel, the club where Tony Montana holds court in the film, where he's recognized, where he has the best table, where cocaine flows and money is everywhere, is clearly modeled on the Mutiny Hotel. The visual style, the social dynamics, the clientele of criminals and beautiful people and celebrities all represent an accurate picture of what the mutiny was during the early 1980s. The final shootout is Hollywood. Say hello to my little friend. The most famous scene in the movie. Tony Montana in his mansion, surrounded by dozens of armed men sent by Alejandro Sosa, wielding a grenade launcher and fighting a one-man army, shooting down intruders until he's finally riddled with bullets and falls into the fountain below his staircase. It is brilliant cinema. It did not happen. Mario Tabraue was arrested by federal agents who knocked on his door with a warrant. Jon Roberts was arrested in a law enforcement operation. None of the major Cocaine Cowboys died in mansion battles. Most were arrested. Some were killed by rivals, but not in the cinematic fashion depicted in the movie. Oliver Stone needed an ending that justified the emotional journey of the film. You've watched Tony Montana for 2 hours and 45 minutes. You've seen him rise from nothing. You've seen him achieve everything. You've seen him lose everything. And now you need a conclusion that has the weight of tragedy, that makes the point about the wages of this life in a way that's visceral, visual, immediate. A federal arrest warrant doesn't do that. A trial doesn't do that. A scene of Tony being handcuffed and led out to a federal vehicle doesn't have the cathartic power of say hello to my little friend. But the reality of these men going to federal prison for decades, of losing everything to government seizure, of surviving and eventually emerging into a world that had moved on without them, is in its own way more haunting than the movie's ending. Tony Montana dies as a legend in the grandest possible fashion. Mario Tabra lived, and living, surviving, rebuilding, becoming an old man who runs a zoo in Miami and appears in Netflix documentaries is a stranger, more complicated, more human story than the legendary death. Tony Montana has one character, one life, one story. Reality is composite. The one-person character simplification is the fundamental dramatic change. Scarface is the story of one man, Tony Montana. His rise, his fall, his relationships, his psychology. The reality was dozens of men with overlapping stories who collectively embodied everything Tony Montana represents. Some were Cuban, like Mario. Some were American, like Jon Roberts. Some were not Cocaine Cowboys in the classic sense, but were part of the machinery, like Max Mermlstein. They had different personalities, different methods, different relationships. The compression into one character makes the movie work dramatically. It gives you someone to follow, someone to understand, someone to feel something about, whether that something is admiration or horror or some complicated mixture of both. But the compression also loses something. It loses the true scale of what happened. It loses the fact that Tony Montana wasn't an exceptional individual. He was representative. There were dozens of him, maybe hundreds, at various levels of the trade. Men who lived some version of his story throughout South Florida in the early 1980s. The movie is the condensed version. The reality was everywhere. The relationship changes are Hollywood necessity. Tony's relationship with his sister, his relationship with Elvira, who he marries, the family dynamics, his mother's disapproval, the sister's attraction to Manny, these were added for emotional depth and dramatic structure. They humanize Tony. They give him relationships that make his trajectory feel personal rather than simply criminal. They allow Oliver Stone to explore Tony's psychology through his treatment of people he claims to love. Real Cocaine Cowboys generally did not have these relationships. The Mariel criminals who became Cocaine Cowboys often had no family in Miami. The American operators like Jon Roberts had complicated personal lives, but not the specific family dynamics depicted in the film. The family subplot is the movie's biggest invention, and arguably its most important dramatic element. Tony Montana's refusal to kill the journalist and his children is the movie's key moral moment. In the film, Sosa orders Tony to plant a car bomb to kill a journalist who is about to expose the cartel. When Tony discovers that the journalist's wife and children will also be in the car, he refuses. He removes the bomb. He kills Sosa's enforcer instead of completing the job. This moment is crucial because it establishes that Tony Montana, despite everything, has a line he will not cross. He is willing to kill adults who are part of the world he operates. He is not willing to kill children. Real cocaine cowboys did not reliably have this line. The Colombian cartel, Griselda Blanco in particular, ordered the killing of children on documented occasions. The cocaine war's violence did not spare innocents. The line that Tony Montana refuses to cross was crossed regularly by the real operators of the Miami drug trade. Oliver Stone needed Tony to be sympathetic. A man with no moral constraints whatsoever is hard to make into a character that an audience will follow for nearly 3 hours. By giving Tony this one line, this one thing he won't do, Stone makes him human in a way that allows the audience to care about his eventual fall. The country of the supplier was changed. Alejandro Sosa in the film is Bolivian. Pablo Escobar was Colombian. The Medellín cartel was Colombian. The cocaine that flooded Miami in the early 1980s came from Colombia. Oliver Stone changed the country of origin of the film's villain, possibly for legal reasons, depicting a real country's drug trade in ways that could be seen as defamatory, had legal risk, possibly to avoid making the film seem like it was specifically about Escobar, who was very much alive in 1983 when the film was released. The change doesn't affect the dramatic truth of the film. The relationship between Tony Montana and Alejandro Sosa functions exactly the way the relationship between American distributors and Colombian cartel functioned in reality. The country of origin is a geographic detail, the power dynamic, the professional relationship, the ultimate betrayal. These are accurate. Here is what was left when it was over. Miami. The city that the Cocaine Cowboys nearly destroyed became, in the late 1980s and 1990s, something extraordinary. The same geography, the water, the weather, the proximity to Latin America that had made Miami the cocaine capital of the world, made it, as the drug trade was suppressed, into something remarkable. The money that had flooded Miami during the cocaine era, even after the seizures and the prosecutions, left behind infrastructure, buildings, roads, a financial services sector that had been developed in part to handle the needs of wealthy Latin American clients, some of whom were in the cocaine trade, but many of whom were not. A banking and finance sector that was sophisticated enough to serve the legitimate needs of the explosion of legal Latin American business that followed. The Latin American community that the cocaine era had painted with such an unjust, broad brush had, through the 1990s and 2000s, built something genuine and remarkable in Miami. Cuban Americans, Colombian Americans, Venezuelan Americans, Brazilian Americans, a dozen other communities, all contributing to making Miami into what it is today. One of the most vibrant, diverse, economically dynamic cities in the United States. A city that is genuinely bilingual, genuinely bicultural, a place where the intersection of North American and Latin American ways of life has produced something unique. The cocaine itself left a terrible legacy. The crack epidemic that devastated American inner cities in the late 1980s and early 1990s was partly the downstream consequence of the cocaine flood that the Cocaine Cowboys helped create. Powder cocaine, expensively sold to wealthy users, was reconstituted into crack cocaine, cheaper, more potent, more addictive, and sold in poor urban communities throughout America. The scale of addiction and the resulting social devastation, the children of addicts, the violence of crack-related gang warfare in American cities, the mass incarceration that followed aggressive prosecution of crack offenses. This is the real, lasting, devastating legacy of the cocaine trade that the Cocaine Cowboys were part of building. The mansions were sold, the Ferraris were auctioned, the money was spent or seized, but the addiction lasted a generation. This is the part of the story that Say Hello to My Little Friend doesn't capture. I want to close with Mario Tabra because his story has the most unexpected ending of all the Cocaine Cowboy. He was released from federal prison in 2000. He was 39 years old. He had served 12 years of a 100-year sentence. He walked out of prison with the deep experience of someone who had spent a decade in the federal prison system and with a lifetime of knowledge about exotic animals, the one passion that had stayed with him through everything. He built the Zoological Wildlife Foundation in Miami. It is a real organization. It has an address. You can visit it. It works with exotic animals, the big cats, the primates, the birds that Mario has loved since his days as a cocaine kingpin. It does genuine zoological work, animal care, conservation education, breeding programs for endangered species. And in 2020, Mario Tabra appeared in Tiger King, Netflix's documentary about Joe Exotic and the world of big cat ownership in America. If you've seen it, and most people who lived through 2020 have seen at least part of it, you know the scene. Mario Tabra on camera talking about big cats, talking about his past, talking about who he is now. He did not run from his history. He acknowledged it. He talked about prison. He talked about what he did. He talked about it with the calm of someone who has made his peace with his past in whatever way he has been able to. He is 63 years old. Tony Montana died at maybe 40 in a mansion with a grenade launcher. Mario Tabraue is 63, running a zoo in Miami, appearing in Netflix documentaries, which is the more extraordinary ending. Let me give you the final accounting, the complete picture of what was real and what was fiction. Real, the Mariel Boatlift, April to October 1980, 125,000 Cubans, approximately 25,000 criminals sent by Castro, the chaos of the processing center, the release of violent men with nothing into a cocaine-saturated city, the cocaine trade, Pablo Escobar and the Medellín Cartel shipping tons of cocaine to Miami every month. The distribution networks built by men like Mario Tabra and Jon Roberts, the billions of dollars flowing through South Florida, the business model that made a kilo of cocaine worth 5 times its purchase price on Miami's streets. Lady, the Dadeland Mall Massacre, July 11th, 1979. Machine guns in a shopping mall parking lot. Bodies on the asphalt, shell casings everywhere, Griselda Blanco's enforcers carrying out a professional hit in the most public possible setting. Real, the chainsaw murders, multiple documented cases, the Colombians using chainsaws as instruments of terror, torture, and murder, the origins of the most infamous scene in cinema history. Real, the car bombs, the motorcycle assassination, the drive-by shootings on I-95, the 600-plus murders per year in a city of 350,000 people. The morgue using grocery trucks to handle the overflow of bodies. Real. Mario Tabra's mansion with its private zoo. Jon Roberts' Star Island mansion with 7 Ferraris. The Mutiny Hotel and its nightly parade of cocaine cowboys. The cocaine on silver platters. The $1 million parties. The cash in the walls. Real. The DEA crackdown. The wiretaps. The informants, the financial forensics, the arrests, the trials, the convictions, the seizure of the mansions and the Ferraris and the cash. Real? Mario Tabra, alive today, running a zoo in Miami. Real? Jon Roberts' memoir, published before his death, telling the whole story from the inside. Real? Max Mermlstein, somewhere in witness protection, living as someone else. Tony Montana, the specific person, the specific story. The chainsaw bathroom scene happening to him specifically, the journey from Mariel refugee to kingpin to mansion death, the say hello to my little friend finale. Fiction built from reality. Every single thing that Tony Montana did. Oliver Stone took the real world of Miami's Cocaine Cowboy, absorbed it, understood it, and compressed it into one fictional man. He made Tony Montana so vivid, so quotable, so real in the minds of everyone who has ever seen that film, that many people assume Tony Montana is based on one specific person. He is based on all of them. He is Mario Tabraue and Jon Roberts and Max Mermlstein and dozens of other men who lived some version of that story throughout South Florida in the early 1980s. He is the Mariel Boatlift. He is the cocaine trade. He is the Mutiny Hotel and the Star Island mansions and the Ferraris and the chainsaw murders and the mall shootouts and the morgue that ran out of space. He is the real history of a city that for a few years was the most violent, the most excessive, the most insane corner of America, distilled into one unforgettable character. Al Pacino gave us Tony Montana, Oliver Stone created him, Brian De Palma directed him, but the real men, the actual cocaine cowboys who walked those streets, made that money, committed that violence, and eventually fell, gave them everything they needed. There is a globe in Tony Montana's mansion, surrounded by jets of water. The words written on it in lights, "The world is yours." It was Tony's dream, the ultimate expression of his ambition. The world, everything, no limits. The real cocaine cowboys had that dream too. They had the mansions, they had Ferraris, they had millions. For a few years, they had something that looked from the outside like they had made good on the promise of those three words. The world was theirs, or something that felt like it. And then hundreds of 12 years in federal prison. Jon Roberts, years in federal prison, then a quiet death after his memoir was published. Max Mermlstein, witness protection, a new name, a new life, gone. Hundreds of others, dead, imprisoned, scattered. The world was not theirs. It never is. Not for anyone who builds it the way they built it. The foundation was made of cocaine and blood. And foundations made of cocaine and blood do not hold. They crumble, they collapse, and when they collapse, they take everything with them. The world was never theirs, but they made one hell of a movie while they were trying to take it. If you watched this entire video, thank you, genuinely. This was the complete story from Cuba in April 1980 to the DEA crackdowns of the late 1980s to Mario Tabraue running a zoo in Miami in 2024. Leave a comment below. Did you know Tony Montana was fictional and based on multiple real people? Does Mario Tabra being alive today and running a zoo in Miami break your brain? Have you seen Scarface, and does this change how you see it? And share this video. Share it with every person in your life who has ever quoted Scarface, who has ever said, "Say hello to my little friend," who has ever watched Tony Montana stand on his desk and think there's something real in that character. There is something real in that character. It's just spread across a dozen real men who actually lived it. Al Pacino played Tony Montana as a Cuban refugee who came to Miami with nothing and died in a mansion with a grenade launcher, having had everything. The reality? There were dozens of Tony Montanas, Cuban criminals who came in the Mariel Boatlift, men who built cocaine empires worth hundreds of millions of dollars, men who drove 7 Ferraris and threw parties that lasted 3 days and served cocaine on silver platters and lived in mansions with private zoos. Men who killed, men who were killed, men who went to prison, men who survived. One runs a zoo in Miami, one wrote a book before he died, one is somewhere in witness protection. Tony Montana is a legend, but the Cocaine Cowboys were real. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.